In this video I'm going to show you how I have removed and refurbished the rear brakes on the Elan. So the first thing I've done was to jack up the car and remove the wheel, then unhook the handbrake cable and plug in a little tube to the bleed nipple and remove all of the brake fluid all of the brake fluid that I could by just pumping out the brake fluid from the system. So then I just removed the bleed nipple out and began disassembling the rest. So this is the normal brake line, just removing that and making sure that I can just catch up all of the brake fluid. And then remove the bleed nipple. And then the caliper has two bolts holding it in the back, which are supposed to be an imperial size, but depending on what you've got, you may find that it's an 18mm if your calipers have been refurbished in the past and those bolts have been swapped. So just removing those 18mm bolts now, and the caliper comes out easily. If the caliper doesn't come out easily, you can always tap it with a rubber hammer if it's binding into the disc. So now I just take the caliper to the workbench and I'm going to start picking up all of the tools that I can think of that are needed in order to do this task. So the first thing that I do is to remove the spring. And in order to do this, I just use a flathead screwdriver and try to prise it off. The next thing I do is to remove the sliding pins. So I'm just flipping around the caliper and then pushing them sideways just to see how free they are. And they are relatively free, but since I'm going to go through the whole system, I'm going to remove them anyway. So in order to remove them, the way I do it is just to push the sliding pin all the way out from one side and make sure that the rubber boot is no longer catching, and then pull it backwards so that then I can push out the rubber boot completely from that side, and then the same in the opposite side, and then I can remove both rubber boots as well as the sliding pin. But here you see I'm just making sure that the boot goes over the sliding pin, then the sliding pin slides out, and then pulling out the boot is just straightforward. So now I'm just doing the same for the other side in fast forward. As you can see, I am particularly careful using the screwdriver so I don't damage the rubber boot. As you could see there, that boot has a small crack on it, so that will be replaced. Now the next thing I did was just to pick up some towel to make sure I don't have brake fluid all over the place. And now I believe that the next thing I did was to remove the brake pads. Now they are clipped in, so you just need to pull those clips out to remove the brake pads. And you can see that the brake pads had some brake fluid on them. So I just had to clean them. To remove the other brake pad, what I did was use a pin and hammered it to just shock it a bit, because sometimes they get a bit seized. So by shocking it a bit with a hammer, I could then release it easily using a screwdriver. So there it is. Now you can see by the size of the pads that they have plenty of life in them, so they will be reused. Now the next thing I've done was to push forwards and backwards the handbrake lever to make sure that I could free it up as much as possible, and expand the piston all the way out. So by doing this I could find out how much resistance I had in the handbrake, and by pushing the piston out I could also remove the little clip thingy, because it's easier to remove them when the piston is further out. Then I put the caliper in the vise and I just pushed all the way out and used a bit of a penetrating fluid to make sure that now I could remove the rear bolt of the piston, not spring, the piston screw. As you could see, it's an imperial size, an 11/16, and then you just remove that and both of the rubber bits behind. Now the next thing, you just need to twist the piston so that it goes all the way out. Now you can use a piston winding tool for this, but I just decided to do it with my needle nose pliers. And then after the piston is out, just use a screwdriver to remove the rubber sleeve. And just be careful, because, well, there's no need to damage it if you don't want to replace it. Now I've been replacing these every year, so I'm very careful with them, because I am more likely to damage them when inspecting them than actually them needing any kind of work. So after removing it and cleaning it all the way, I could see that it was in perfectly good condition. Now I removed the spring that pushes the piston out. I'm just making sure that I can clean as much as possible of the crude. Now I need to use the snap rings, and I'm going to remove the little circlip that holds the this circlip is there in order to stop a different rubber bit that is around the piston, so it stops the oil from flowing out. It's not very easy to remove, as you can see. It took me a bit of time, but there it is, the circlip, and you can see it on the other screen. And now, using the needle nose pliers, I can pull out the little ring. This is the ring that I was talking about, the one that stops the grease, the fluid from flowing around the piston. Or so I believe. I may be incorrect there. So then the next thing to do is to remove this screw. But of course, before, you need to take everything out. So the screw may be difficult to remove, and in that case I have used a rubber mallet just to make sure that I could shock it out of the place. And then obviously just use some paper towel to clean it as much as possible and make sure that it's in good condition to go back in. Otherwise you may need to replace it as well. Now, I've decided to sandblast and paint the caliper. So in order to protect the sliding pin and the piston housing, I've just fabricated something to protect it. And then a few hours later, here's the result of a sandblasted caliper. And then I painted the caliper using some Amarit. So in the meanwhile, while waiting for the paint to dry, I've decided to work on the inner bits of the caliper. So I had some silicone grease on the side and some paper towels. So I'm just cleaning out every single one of the bits that are there and inspecting them. Now I paid close attention to the piston, because the piston is, well, the main part of the job. And I gave it a very good brush around the heading, and then I used this Dremel just to make sure that what I had around in the ring was just dust and no rust at all. So using a Dremel, I made sure that everything was absolutely spotless and I didn't need to get a new piston. Then the rubber boots, I have just cleaned them all and used a bit of silicone spray so that it protects them. Then I've cleaned up the pads, and the pads had a bit of oil on them, so just needed to clean them. And now that I have the caliper painted and dried, I just take everything apart and start reassembling it. But I only do that after I confirm that everything is absolutely spotless. So I used my water gun with the air compressor and some brake fluid to clean everything again. So now that I am absolutely sure that there's no sound anywhere inside of the system, I can start reassembling. So the first thing I've done was just to absolutely ensure that the inner bits are cleaned with the Dremel, because I did not sandblast the inside for obvious reasons. So the first thing that goes, it's the piston screw, and then I have the two seals, rubber seals on the back of the piston screw. And then in order to ensure that the seals are in place, there is a ring that has an hexagonal shape that matches the side of the piston screw, as you can see here. And then you put the bracket in place, correctly aligned, which it's not always so very obvious to figure out. And then the screw goes in. Now at this point you don't screw it all the way in, because what I found from experience is that the rubber seals tend to move a bit. So I just screw it a tiny bit, and then I use a flathead screwdriver to make sure that it's all in place. Right now I'm just putting the rubber seal around the piston and then reassembling everything else. So the spring goes back in, then the piston plus its rubber seal goes in, and then we need to twist it as we are pushing it inwards, so I'm using the pliers for that. And then the circlip, so that the rubber seal doesn't come out, obviously. And yes, it looks like it's a lot easier to put it in than it's to remove it, but well, I guess it's a matter of experience. Then you have the outer rubber seal, or well, this is more of a rubber dust cover. And in order to make sure that it's pushed flat, I usually use a socket to make sure I can push it in all around the circle to sit it in place. Then I push the rubber, the piston out to sit the rest of the rubber around it and push the piston back in. And then we have the two sliding pins that take some silicone grease in order to go in, and then the rubber boots go back in, the new boots obviously. And the final bit is just to put the clips, the metal clip in place. So I find it easier to remove this metal clip, to put this metal clip when the piston is out and then wind it back in. And finally, the brake pads go back in with some copper grease in all of the areas that are supposed to slide or you don't want them to seize. So I have the back of the piston so that it doesn't seize against the caliper. The back of the pads so it doesn't seize against the piston. And then the outer side, I also put some grease on it so that I don't have the issue that I started with in the beginning of the video, where it didn't want to come out. But there it is. This is now complete refurbished brake pad fitting is just the reverse of the removal, and you can see it from the video. I just put a speed up process for it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.